Welcome to the Estate Blueprint, Planning Your Future with Tom Begley.
Hello and welcome to the Estate Blueprint, Planning Your Future with Tom Begley, where clarity meets compassion in estate planning. Join Tom and I as we break down the essentials of wills, trusts, long-term care, and legacy protection. I am your host, Kevin Rosenquist, and today's episode is, Do I Really Need a Trust? Weighing the pros and cons. Tom, welcome back.
Thanks. Great to be back, Kevin. Let's fire away.
All right. Well, I feel like trusts are an interesting topic because a lot of times people don't understand what they are. They're often associated with super rich people. So can you just kind of go over what a living trust is and how it differs from a will?
People often come to my office and they assume they need to have a trust. But they don't know what the trust is and they don't know why they need it. But just somebody, Cousin Mabel or Sam the Butcher says you need to have a trust and they're hell-bent on having it. And it's sometimes what's called a will substitute. There's reasons to have a living trust, but a living trust is just one of many types of trusts which are out there. For example, a living trust is something that avoids probate. It can do other things such as provide privacy, which we can get into momentarily. And then on top of that, but there's a lot of things that it doesn't do, which people misrepresent that it does. A lot of people say that it's a great tool to minimize long-term care costs or death taxes, but it does neither. Because the person who is the grantor of the trust typically establishes a trust that the assets benefit them during the course of their lives. So it's treated from a tax purpose standpoint and from a long-term care standpoint, just as if the assets were still in their name. In many states, the living trust is something that merely makes the administration of the estate much, much easier and smoother. But there certainly are benefits to having them. But trusts are basically agreements. And like a will is a very finite document. The will says one thing and one thing only. I die, this is where my money goes, and this is going to get there to the beneficiaries. But a trust has a purpose. So like the living trust, avoiding probate, privacy, reduction sometimes of commissions. But there are other trusts, for example, such as a special needs trust. And that's a trust whereby you leave assets behind to a beneficiary who happens to be disabled and relying on needs-based government benefits. And that's a trust that makes sure that the individual have a pool of assets to supplement their life above and beyond what the government's going to do for them. You can have trusts that can actually be separate or within a trust itself or within a will itself, a marital trust. For example, you're married for a second or third time and you have children from a prior marriage. And when you're married, you may want to take care of your spouse, but on the flip side of the coin, when they pass away, you want to make sure that whatever you brought into the marriage goes to your family and whatever he or she brought into the marriage goes to their family. And that's a type of trust that accomplishes that. So the interesting thing about trust right from the get-go is you have to ask yourself, why do I need a trust?
And how do you help people answer that question?
Well, I try to set forth, first thing when they come in and say, I need to have a trust, basically I'll say, well, why do you think you need one? And sometimes they'll have some reasons. Like they'll say, look, I've got some property outside of the state. And that makes sense because as easy as New Jersey probate is, if you go to other states such as Florida or California, probate's somewhat cumbersome and it costs a fair amount of money to definitely handle probate when it's a second residence in a second state, because it's interesting. When you pass away, your assets are handled as far as liquid assets. So let me back it up. If you're in New Jersey, somebody passes away, then the executor can handle the liquid assets plus the real estate that's in New Jersey. However, if there's real estate outside New Jersey, there has to be a second or ancillary probate. The idea being that real estate is governed by the states in which it is located. So even if you can take care of everything else in the state of New Jersey, if you have that condo down in Florida and it's in your name, your executor has to not only probate the estate down here, but then they have to go to Florida and open up a new probate there. Yeah. And some states are much easier to deal with than others. For example, Pennsylvania is real easy. If somebody has a piece of real estate over there, it's not that big of a deal because Pennsylvania is very user-friendly. You just have to file an exemplified copy of the proceedings with New Jersey over in Pennsylvania, and that's automatically good enough to allow you to convey residence out there. On the flip side of the coin, if you're down in sunny Florida, you have to get the exemplified copy of the proceedings down to an attorney there who not only has to file it with the local probate court, but has to file it with a petition. And every time I've had to do this, the bargain basement price I've seen is $3,500, but it's often more like $5,500 just to get the process started. So for people that have real estate outside of New Jersey, typically I recommend that you have a living trust and you put your property into that living trust to avoid that additional and unnecessary probate. But usually, a lot of times when people are not sure what they want to do, then I say, relax. Let me just go over a variety of topics, and we're going to see what you need and what you don't need. And typically, when I meet with individuals, before they come in, they have to complete an intake form. And in the intake form, I want to know about their personal background. For example, if they got children, how old are the kids, if they're adults, their address, because we may need that for their estate planning documents. And then about their financial background. What do they own individually, if they're married jointly, and if they have assets that pass outside of probate. You want to get a sense of what's out there so you know what you need to do. And then I always have a certain list of topics that I follow. The three topics that I always go through are the basics, making sure that people have good wills, good living wills, and good powers of attorney. The second is I go through probate because, as you asked at the very outset, do you need to have a living trust? And a lot of people are hell-bent on having them when they really don't need them in New Jersey. As I've told people, if you have all of your real estate in the state of New Jersey and all of your liquid assets here, then when you pass away, there's no need to have a living trust because everything will go through a very, very easy probate process. Having said that, I've often over the years didn't say anything many years ago to clients, and then 6 months down the road, I get an angry phone call saying, "Why didn't you get me a living trust?" And I initially said, "Well, I just didn't want to steal money from you because you didn't need it." But I just found for the 2 or 3 minutes it takes, I explain to people the advantages and disadvantages of living trust. And the other thing I do talk about is death taxes. A lot of people are concerned with death taxes, but that has changed radically, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in another episode. But those are the 3 things that I go through with everyone. So if somebody needs to know whether or not they have a trust, needs to be drafted on their behalf, I'll usually discuss that with them, with the course of the hour and a half consultation that I'll have with them.
Are there any downsides to using a trust?
So as far as a living trust, there are things that you can't do with a living trust. As I said before, there are a lot of trust mills and some unscrupulous attorneys or just some people that don't know better that think that a living trust does more than it can. They'll tell people that it'll protect your estate from long-term care costs. It doesn't. They'll say it protects from taxes. It doesn't. And it's just treated the same as the individual name. This main thing is to avoid probate. It happens to be private, which I do think is a good function. But you can't put everything into a trust because if you take assets such as an IRA and you transfer the IRA or the 401k into the living trust, even if you don't touch a penny in the account, it is treated like an entire withdrawal, and you've got a huge tax bill that goes to Uncle Sam the following year. Mm-hmm. But people generally, are not silly enough to do something like that. So there really is no downside to the trust except for the fact that you're paying for a document that is going to cost more. There's a lot of people that can do good estate planning work when individuals have modest estates, and sometimes it can be in the high hundreds or maybe a little bit over 1,000. But when you're starting to talk about living trust, you're talking about maybe a few $1,000s. So for someone that's going to get a living trust, are they getting anything of value for that extra $1,000 or $2,000 in legal fees?
I've heard a mistake people make is they get a trust, but they don't put anything in it.
Yeah, and that's true. The trust is only as good as what you do with it.
Right.
Now, having said that, in New Jersey, there's a lot of times when we will have what I call an unfunded trust because once again, you pass away, probate's pretty easy. However, what we'll do is make the beneficiary of the non-probate assets, that is the IRAs or the annuities or the insurance, sometimes will make the beneficiary the trust. It's a first marriage, we typically maintain the spouse as a primary and then make the trust as a backup. You have to put, for tax purposes, you need to put some language in your living trust to make sure that we don't accelerate the payment of income taxes. But, it's kind of funded upon death. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. As I said, if you have real estate outside New Jersey, you definitely need to put the real estate in while you're alive.
Mm-hmm. Are there other mistakes you see people make other than that when it comes to trusts?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do, unfortunately. The living trust, generally, I don't see a ton of mistakes in the fact that it's a living trust. And the mistakes that I see get made just as easily with a will as they're made with the living trust. The person, either it's a deficient internet program or the attorney, they're a general practitioner. And now there's some what I call Renaissance men and women out there that can do everything. But more often than not, I see too many people in the profession where their qualification to handle the preparation of a will or a trust doesn't exceed their desire to just cash the client's check. They don't really keep up with the scene, and we see some really bad things happen during the planning process. But for example, I have the case where mom and dad have 3 children, one has a disability, and they realize that they have to take care of that child, but they'll do one of two things based on bad advice given to them. One is they'll leave everything to the two healthy children with the reliance that those healthy children are going to turn around and take care of their brother and sister. And even if they have the nicest kids in the world, there's nothing to say those nice kids are not going to predecease that child. And that person's, that healthy child's, husband or wife, if they're married, they may not feel the same obligation to take care of the disabled child as their brothers and sisters do. Also, sometimes we had the case where I had left everything to her healthy daughter to take care of her daughter with a disability, and there was a divorce action, and once again, bad things happen. So the other thing that I see more often than not, though, is what's called the creation of a support trust. So somebody will basically say that I'm going to leave everything in trust for my child who has a disability, and it's for the health support and maintenance. But that is language, the health support, or they call it the HEM standard, health education maintenance support. When that language is inside a trust, it's treated from a benefit standpoint like it's in the individual's name. And if they're on SSI or Medicaid or HUD housing or anything, they're disqualified pretty quickly for that. So yeah, a fair amount of mistakes do get made as far as the drafting. And then the other thing I see often is people will leave money to kids at the age of 18 or 21. And being the father of 5 and the grandfather of 3, that's not really the smartest thing that you can do. Quite frankly, I'm 63 now, but when I look back at my youth, I've told folks honestly, if I'd gotten a big inheritance when I was 21, there probably would have been a golden calf on the front of my fraternity swan, but I would have spent the money wisely. So oftentimes I think that we have to reflect upon the amount of money that needs to be set aside until someone's old enough to appreciate the value of a dollar. So there's just lots of things that should be done better that aren't. Or the other thing I see is they'll create trusts for minor children, but they won't appoint a trustee. So,
yeah,
lots of bad stuff. So you get to go to court to get someone to appoint the trustee. Normally, it's the executor because if they went to somebody who was a little bit of a dingling to prepare their estate planning documents.
Yeah, I got to do it right up at the front end. You mentioned earlier that people will come in just hell bent on getting a trust. Why do you think people are so intense about that? Is there a misnomer? Is there a misunderstanding out there about what a trust does? Do you think it's just, I think you made the comment that their friends or family has one, so they think they need one. Why do you think people are so misinformed about what a trust does?
I do think because there's lots of misinformation out there. A lot of times you get on the internet and they talk about the pros and cons of trust. And unfortunately, they have there's what I call a one-size-fits-all approach to estate planning. I mean, look, if you and I were in Colorado or New Jersey or Florida and had a massive heart attack and we need to go to the hospital, it's pretty well understood that the procedure to take care of that heart attack is going to be the same in each of those states. However, the law varies wildly from state to state. So in New Jersey, we have very easy probate. Florida, we don't, for example. But people don't realize that the laws differ from state 1 to state 2. So in New Jersey, everybody hears about what happened to their friend in Florida or their friend in California who insisted they need to have a trust. And those people absolutely do need to have a trust. But they wind up telling their mom and dad who are still living in New Jersey, you need to get a trust when they don't necessarily need to do so. The other thing also is there's a lot of attorneys that are, I'll say, ethically challenged, and also a lot of trust mills out there that really frighten people into getting living trusts when they don't need them. They tell them all sorts of crazy misrepresentations, such as that it's going to take thousands of dollars and take many months to get the most simple thing done. Whereas in New Jersey, it's less than $200 typically to probate a will, and you can do it 10 days after death. They tell people that the attorney that drafted the will has to do it, or there's no requirement for an attorney whatsoever. I always like the fact they said the attorney is going to get paid like $60,000 or $70,000 a case, which is silly, especially and then minor cases where they don't need an attorney at all. And then they're told that the executor gets a commission of 10%. That's not true. The commission for an executor is a fraction of that. So 5% of the first $200,000, 3.5% of the next $800,000, and 2% of the balance. Certainly not 10%. So just really lots of wild misrepresentations that frighten people, especially those who are in the older age groups, to go out and get something that they may not need.
Yeah, that seems very predatory. Unfortunately, that people do that. So for anyone listening who might be going, I got to get my estate plan together. They're not sure if they need a trust. They're not sure what exactly they need. What should they do?
So, and look, I'm not hustling for the legal profession per se, but the old saying goes in life: you get what you pay for. And I think my dad had a great line years ago who taught me a lot about the practice of law. He said, look, if you got sick and you needed an operation, you wouldn't perform it on yourself. You'd get a qualified medical professional to do it for you. So a lot of people do get hung up on the idea of hiring professional help because they hear all the stories, and far too many are true, about people that are gouged financially. But if you go to a reputable attorney and you get some good advice, you're going to be in good shape. I tell people that the value of an attorney is not the production of the documents. Certainly, I can spit out legal documents. A computer program can spit out legal documents. The value of going to a qualified estate planning attorney is the advice. Because when people come to me, I sit and listen to them and I ask them the questions because, we're not all married with 3 kids. I mean, we have second marriages. We have children that are estranged. We have children that have disabilities. We have children that are in marriages that may not be functional. We also have many people that don't have children whatsoever. In New Jersey, when you don't have children, there may be an issue regarding inheritance tax that you may need to plan for. So the idea is that when you sit down with an attorney that knows what they're doing, they can listen and hear what you need and guide you in the right direction. When you go to an internet program with somebody who really is not qualified, and you tell them what you want, they'll give you what you say you want. But for example, this morning I met with someone who came in because their husband was just diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and they know sometime in the not too distant future, they're going to require some care outside of the home. And when they came to work with me, they wanted to make sure they had the will and the living will and the power of attorney in order, which we certainly are going to do. But if they'd gone to someone who wasn't qualified or the internet, that's all that would have occurred. What I was able to do is sit down and listen to them. And when the wife said, well, my husband just got diagnosed with Alzheimer's and we're concerned about what's going to happen in the future, I explained, well, in addition to the basic estate plan concerns, you need to be concerned with protecting your assets to minimize the cost of those long-term fees that are going to be incurred if he probably most likely will require some placement in a long-term care facility such as an assisted living facility or a nursing home. In New Jersey, you can pay $15,000, $16,000 a month without blinking an eye for good quality nursing care. And people that have saved up a lot over the years can watch a lot of their assets get dissipated. But that's an example of where somebody comes and they think they didn't even think about that issue until it was brought up for them.
Mm-hmm.
And it also sometimes goes in reverse. You get the person comes in, they're hell-bent on the fact that they need a trust, but then they're relieved when you actually look at them in the eye and say, you know what, why don't you save a couple of dollars and do something fun with it rather than blow it on legal fees. So the advantage of a qualified professional is the advice that you get and as to what you need to do and sometimes what you not need to do.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense for sure. All right. Well, thanks for joining us on the Estate Blueprint, and don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. We love having you be part of our community here. And remember, the best plan is the one that starts today. Tom, so good to see you again. Thanks so much for all the insight.
Great seeing you, Kevin. Have a good one.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.